Affidavits and volumes of documents have been filed on behalf of the Chinese government in the ongoing breach of trust, fraud and dishonesty case. It involves a dispute of over $12 million belonging to Citic Pacific. That's the Chinese state-owned enterprise, and also between Clive Palmer's mining partner in WA, which Citic alleges was fraudulently and dishonestly used by the Palmer United Party leader to fund his election campaign. Now, Clive Palmer, as we know, strenuously denies those allegations. Yet the genesis of the complete breakdown of relations between the Queensland businessman turned politician and his Chinese partners goes a long way back to a dispute over mining royalties relating to a massive magnetite project in the Pilbarra. So how did it all go wrong? Our business editor Cheryl Bagwell takes a look.
Clive Palmer was out and about again yesterday, trying to explain why he launched his extraordinary tirade against the Chinese, describing them as bastards who shoot their own people.
My comments on Q&A were not directed to Chinese people, but they're directed to state-owned companies owned by the government of China that are seeking to get control of Australian resources, and that's a different issue.
The Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, though, was not buying Clive Palmer's excuse for his outburst, which the PM called shrill and wrong.
It seemed to be more an expression of a personal business issue than of a considered national policy.
So what exactly is the business issue that has now so spectacularly collided with Clive Palmer's public position as an elected federal parliamentarian? Clive Palmer told ABC Radio in Perth it all goes back to the non-payment of mining royalties.
We entered into a contract with the Chinese. If you go to their website on the 21st of March 2006, they announced what royalties they'd be paying for the deal we did with them, and we gave them control of all of our land on that basis. They went ahead and spent $10 billion building the project. They failed to pay, and they're still shipping Australian ore to China without paying for it.
The project in question is WA's Sino-Iron, Australia's largest magnetite mining and processing operation. It's owned by Citic Pacific, part of the powerful Citic Group, a Chinese state-owned investment fund. Citic paid $415 million to Clive Palmer's company Mineralogy to mine his land, a sprawling cattle farm in the Pilbarra. Citic also reached an agreement with Palmer to pay royalties on each shipment of magnetite, which is a lower grade iron ore used in the making of steel. It's that agreement that's now in dispute. Peter Strachan is a Perth-based independent mining analyst, as well as the author of Stock Analysis. He says the Sino-Iron project has been troubled from the start.
The ore is low grade with respect to iron, but it's a magnetite ore. It's a complex metallurgical issue. It's not the same as direct shipping of hematite, which you just basically dig out of the ground and put into a ship. It's a very complex, it's a sort of 8 million tonne a year operation, though I understand it's only operating at about 60% of that capacity. The project itself is about 3 times over budget in terms of its cost, and much delayed, I think about 18 months, if not a little bit more, in terms of the time it's taken to bring it up to production.
Peter Strachan says the delays, the cost overruns, and now the legal battle with their erstwhile business partner would be a huge embarrassment for the Chinese.
What is perhaps not well understood here is the loss of faith that can come with this sort of activity. You know, I can imagine, you know, the people who've entered into these agreements over the past decade or so are probably now finding themselves in a far-flung village in outer Mongolia, you know, looking after the garbage disposal unit or something, you know, as reward for their efforts in Australia. So, and I don't think it's been a hugely successful sort of escapade.
That might explain Citic's determination to pursue Clive Palmer over another unresolved dispute, his alleged use of $12 million of Citic's money for his own election campaign. Hedley Thomas is a senior Brisbane-based journalist for the Australian newspaper.
Chinese government-owned company Citic Pacific is alleging fraud and dishonesty by Mr Palmer in relation to some $12 million that left an account, a National Australia Bank account that Mr Palmer's company controlled. And this account was holding the funds because they were only meant to be used in the operation of a port, an iron ore export port in WA. But as subsequent investigations by the Chinese government and through discovery of documents have found, the money was funneled out of the account, and at least some of it went into Mr Palmer's political party, the Palmer United Party, in the lead up to the federal election last year.
What did Clive Palmer say that the money had been spent on?
Well, initially there was a one-line entry in the ledger, and the Chinese government was told that their money was spent on port management services. And these are the two largest withdrawals, one of 10 million in August last year and another 2.167 million just a couple of days before the federal election. Now, as a result of the production of checks and other documents, it's clear that some of these millions of dollars went into the Brisbane Advertising Agency that did the Palmer United Party's election advertising. Mr Palmer says now that he could do with the money what he saw fit.
Hedley Thomas, who has regularly attracted the ire of Clive Palmer through his dogged reporting of his business affairs, says the case could have huge ramifications for the businessman and for his political career.
Well, because the accusation is fraud, if the civil case is won by the Chinese government in that matter, then I would expect that the police would want to become directly involved. It's a very serious allegation to make, fraud.
That would make it a criminal matter.
Yes.
And if, again, I mean, going way down the track, I mean, if he were to be found guilty, you know, he could lose his seat in Parliament.
Yes.
Hedley Thomas also says the legal disputes are becoming a drain on Clive Palmer's finances.
There's a widely held but wrong view that Mr Palmer is incredibly wealthy, a billionaire. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. And these cases are costing him a fortune, and he faces a situation where the funder of a project that is based on his iron ore tenements is accusing him of fraud and dishonesty, so it's completely broken down.
But as this week's outburst showed, Clive Palmer is not giving up without a fight, even if it puts Australia's trade relationship with China at risk. Yesterday, the state-owned Beijing newspaper, the Global Times, said China should consider placing sanctions on Clive Palmer and his companies and even banning him and his executives from entering China. In WA, Peter Strachan says the mining community is concerned, but he believes the storm will eventually pass.
I think people are really rolling their eyes and saying, well, we told you so, about how could 5 or 6% of the population vote for his party in the first place. I mean, it was a bit of a mystery to most of us. So there's a lot of tut-tutting, but I don't think that we're really going to see this as being a long-term negative for partnerships with China.
That's Peter Strachan, a Perth-based independent analyst and author of Stock Analysis, ending that report from our business editor, Cheryl Bagwell.
Well, there you go, viewers. Particularly Richard Mann, thank you for your little bouquet on the comment thread on my previous movie about Clive Palmer. So, as is usual with my stuff, I wasn't entirely correct. It's $12.5 million, and he spent it with a Brisbane advertising firm, but it was for the administration of his export magnetite enterprise in the Pilbarra, and they're charging him with fraud. The Chinese are charging him with fraud in the civil court. That's really strange. I'm surprised they didn't go straight to the police. It's interesting that the police in Queensland are going to sit on their hands and wait until Clive emerges from a civil fraud case before they decide whether or not to charge him. But I think it seems like he's in the process of thoroughly self-destructing his empire, and he might be on the rich list as being allegedly worth $500 million, but a lot of that $500 million assets that he supposedly is in control of or worth, they're stranded assets. It's low-grade iron ore miles from anywhere, and the Chinese are now kicking themselves in the arse for having got sucked into building the Pilbarra scheme because it's not commercially viable, or it's a lump of coal in the middle of Queensland with no way of getting it to the coast. That was why he put so much money into the Queensland National Party, with the idea that he could draft a bill and they would enact it as a law, and it would, make him king of the Galilee Basin. What else? Oh yeah, bit of a postscript to Robert Hartlepool. I'm guessing your comment may have been tongue-in-cheek, but it may not have been. wondering why I had the film of the wallabies engaged in foreplay, and if they had have taken their activity further, I would have continued to film. It's like this, Robert. I was trying to capture what was on the radio, current affairs program. The wallabies in the clearing were the most interesting background visuals I could come up with, other than just pointing the camera at the little crystal ball or pointing the camera at the radio. And there's a lot of people have never seen wallabies smooching up to one another. I don't find uncontrived wildlife footage to be offensive. Think of it as an educational opportunity. I think there's only one out of over 1,400 of my movies that actually shows marsupials having sex. It's wildlife documentary, mate. It's not marsupial porn, but I guess it's in the eye of the beholder. But anyway, yeah, that's the follow-up to Clive Palmer, and some of what was said there you may have to take with a bit of a grain of salt, because remember, the bloke from The Australian works for Rupert Murdoch, and you can imagine why Rupert Murdoch might enjoy funding a newspaper which pays a journalist to track down and hunt Clive Palmer, because Clive Palmer is a threat to the Liberal National Party's ability to govern. He's considered as something of a turncoat in the right-wing conservative side of politics, because once upon a time he was on their side. Like I said, he donated heaps and heaps and heaps of money to the Queensland Nationals, and as I said in the other movie, he used to be the press secretary for Joh Bjelke-Petersen back in the days when Joh Bjelke-Petersen was in the fantasy game of thinking he could get elected to be Prime Minister. Clive Palmer was the bloke who tried to make that happen, and Joh Bjelke-Petersen is the most corrupt Premier in the history of Australia. Right? Clive Palmer has a track record of being a really, really shady character whose main motivation is Clive Palmer. Nothing else. It's just Clive Palmer, Clive Palmer, Clive Palmer. And yeah, he has chosen to risk Australia's trade relationship with China because he wanted to have a temper tantrum regarding the fact that the Chinese are suing him for fraud. And by the sounds of it, they've got their ducks lined up in a row. They've got their paperwork. They've got the checks that he wrote to the advertising company for the money that they gave him for port administration. I think they're going to get him. I think Clive Palmer is on the way down. And I wonder what the Clive Palmer United Party senator from Tasmania, the puppet Jackie Lambie, I wonder what she thinks about the idea that she was elected with Chinese communist government money that was fraudulently misappropriated by the Palmer United Party's leader. Interesting question, isn't it? Does a racist shut up and stop carrying on like that when they're being paid? Or do they only open their mouth and start huffing and puffing when the payments to be quiet stop? Who knows? Warble's on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.